Hey, so today's tutorial is all going to be about layering up your guitar parts and maximizing the way that you layer them in order to get really big sounding, well-produced tracks. I'm going to use this little example here that I knocked up in order to show you how I created it and layered it up so you guys can see in real time how that happens. What I've done here is I've copied this part here over here and deleted all of these guitar parts at the top. So we're going to try and recreate it step by step over here. We started off with the drums, if you have a listen. And I've used primarily the Logic Drummer and some extra layers on top. And if you want to know how to use the Logic Drummer plugin in order to get some real live sounding drums on your tracks and get them sounding huge, I suggest you watch a video that I did on the Logic Drummer, and there's a tutorial for it, and I'm going to put the link below so you can follow that and work your way through it. But what we're going to look at today is what the first thing you do when you're in a band or you start recording your own tracks is you lay down your guitar parts. And something that a lot of new producers fall into as a trap is that you just do one part for your guitar. So you might just do one rhythm part or one lead line, or if you've got a riff, you might just do it on one guitar. And all of the tracks that you listen to by your favourite bands nearly always have more than one guitar part, and they layer up different sections, and it just makes those parts sound bigger. And if you listen to your tracks and thinking, why do my tracks not sound as good as other people's and other bands that I love, this is probably the reason. So you probably want to watch this and use some of these tips and tricks in your production yourself. In order to make this nice and easy to record the video, I've not mic'd up my guitar. I've actually put it through Guitar Rig, which is a amp modeler from Native Instruments. It's pretty good. There's lots of amp modelers out there. There's some that even come built into Logic. They're okay. You can get some decent sounds if you play around. And like many amp modelers, they don't overtly say what pieces of equipment they're copying, but obviously you can see from here this is supposed to be a Marshall amp. And then the plugin is called Ram-Ones, which obviously they're trying to go for that Ramones kind of sound. I quite like Native Instruments. They're kind of quite cryptic as to what tracks Pete won't explain, like a Who thing, Edged With You for like a U2 kind of thing. Quite funny. Anyway, so I've loaded this up already. Let's just have a listen to the sound. I do apologise, my guitar needs a little bit more shielding, I've realised, because it's a little bit noisy when I turn it on there. So we've got a guitar going in there. And it sounds pretty cool. The trick is when you're layering up guitar parts, especially if you're going for a distorted riff kind of sound, is that don't put too much distortion or overdrive on tracks, because the more tracks that you introduce, and we're going to be layering up a few things here today, the heavier it sounds when you add more and more distortion, but the more and more muddy it gets. So what I like to do is to have like a bit of overdrive, and then the more parts we layer on there, the heavier it's going to get. Whereas if we started off with a really distorted sound, it can get really muddy by the time you've got 3 or 4 tracks on there. So we're going to start off, we're going to record our little riff. Because we need to start somewhere. So we're going to start, I've kind of set it up here. I've put some, a bit of like processing on here already. And because I've been mixing it earlier, it's also going through to my reverb unit. But let's just record that riff in there. Go. Let's just take that input monitoring off there. So we've got our riff in there. Let's just chop the last little bit of it. So we've got a nice 8 bars here. Sounds good. Now, the first thing you can do in terms of making this riff sound a lot bigger than it is what I've done is I've duplicated this track below, and let's just stick it on the same bit. And I've got exactly the same kind of amp plugged in here. All I've done is slightly tweaked it, so it's got like a bit of a tube screamer emulator on the top, and it just gives it an ever so slightly different sound. Because the worst thing you can do is if you copy the amp settings exactly, or if you're layering it up with your own amp and pedals at home and miking it up, if you record it exactly the same, you can get phasing issues, and also it doesn't sound quite as big. Whereas if you slightly tweak the overdrive or distortion and you slightly tweak the sound on your guitar, it sounds like two different guitars, and it really has an impact. So we're going to record exactly the same riff on top of this, and what I could do is I could just copy it from here, and that would kind of double it up a little bit, apart from the fact it would just sound like one guitar going through two different amps. The trick to double tracking, and this works with everything that you're going to double track, so guitars or vocals or whatever, is the tiny little differences in the way you play and the timing is what gives it that huge double tracked beefiness to your tracks. So if I want this to sound as big as possible, it's a good idea to duplicate this by playing it again. Let's try that. So we've got our second track there, and so tip number one, just double up your guitar part. So you can just keep it same pans in the middle, and it's just going to sound bigger than it did before. Another interesting technique you can use is you can start to use panning on your guitars as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ever so slightly, say kind of 20, pan it one side, and pan the other one slightly the other side, and it just gives you a little bit of width in your mix. Do you know what? I'm going to slightly cheat here as well, because this is a sneaky little tip you can do. I actually think the first part of that, some of the timing is slightly out in the first guitar. So I'm going to chop that in half, and because it's the same riff played twice, I'm actually going to cheat and just copy that second half to the first half. So that's tip number one. So you can record it exactly the same, slightly tweak the settings and pan it a little bit. What we're also going to do is we're going to go a little bit overboard here, and on here you can see what's coming up. So we've got the riff here in the center, or ever so slightly off center. What we're going to do here is we're going to record it fully left, and then below we're going to record one fully right. And again, we could copy these parts down here, but they're really not going to sound as big. They're going to just they're going to sound like one guitar going through multiple cabinets, whereas actually if we want it to sound huge, we want to add extra takes on top of here. So let's just do an extra take for that left side. So there we've got our extra take. Let's just solo it so you can hear what it sounds like. I'm actually going to cheat here. Actually, I'm going to show you like if you're in post-production, so you say you've been in the studio and you've recorded all your guitar parts, and you're mixing your track, and there's no way of adding extra guitar parts. Here is a cheeky way of doubling up something that is repeated. So this riff, don't forget, this first half here, this bit here is exactly the same as this bit here. And what you can do is, if you're mixing it later on and you can't get back in the studio, or you can't mic up your amp in the same way, what you can do is you can cheat. So you can take the second half here, I'm going to copy it underneath this first part here, and on this one I'm going to take the first part here and copy it there. So out of nowhere I've managed to take one take and turn it into two different takes here. And this is the same where I've got this going through a slightly different setting on my amp. I've got like a Stevie Ray Vaughan emulating thing here. And I've got one going hard left and hard right with my guitar. So if I layer them all up together, they should sound pretty big. So already that's sounding pretty cool for, 5 minutes work, layering up our guitars. Now, another little tip to get your guitar part sounding really big is without wanting to, because the idea is the more guitar parts you layer up on here, the more dense and complicated this is going to sound. So if you start adding lead lines or solos, it's going to get very complicated very quickly. Now, here's a way of what you do is you basically, you pick out little bits of this riff. So that riff, if we listen to it, where are we at? So what I want to do in this next part is to try and bring out some of those rhythms. So what I'm going to do is bring out that bottom note, that... And by recording it on a separate track, it'll really give a boost to that, because I've got my kick drum and my guitar syncing up at that point. So if I add those extra chugs down the bottom, it's going to really add a little bit of power to that section. Let's try that. So we've got our chugs recorded in there. Let's just have a listen. I'm going to use the same trick that I did before, just because I'm being lazy. I'm going to chop that in half. I'm going to put this half on a second track, so we can have two lots of chugs. Oops. I'm going to take this first part and copy it there. So if we add all of these together, it should sound pretty big. So that's that. Next, we're going to be looking at a little bit of bass on here. So I'm just going to quickly chop my guitars, or the slightly noisy sounds in the background. So I'm going to get my bass, and there's a couple of ways that I would approach this as a bass player. Number one is you've got two options here. With the bass, you could be playing something like along the lines of these chugs with this track. Or you could even just play the riff like the guitars. And as well, I know this is going to offend some bass players, but you can even play it with a pick if you want that really like kind of twangy sound to cut through. But I'm going to play it with my fingers because I like the sound. So we're going to layer up the bass on top of here. And a lot of the times when you're recording in the studio, as soon as you get the bass on there, it just adds so much power. So let's just add that on now. So we've got our bass on there, which sounds fantastic. And lastly, the last little tip that I was going to give you guys is, you'll notice underneath, and this might be surprising recording the rock track. Sorry, I just put my bass down. There's 2 tracks labelled acoustic, and what I've done earlier, because it's a bit of a faff to do it while I'm recording this video, is I recorded an acoustic playing the riff. Let's just have a listen to it. I will say this as well, that normally I would record acoustic guitars with 2 microphones, but because this is just going to be in the background here, I just use 1. And the tip is with this acoustic is a lot of producers record an acoustic playing the riff, and what it does is when you add it in on top of the riff, especially if you've got a guitar part like that where there's really no bottom end to it, you can just hear those twangs up at the top, and if you layer that up on top of your main riff, it just gives it a little bit bite and clarity to it. Let's just have a listen. Especially if you blend it in with everything else. So if you kind of copy this guitar, this acoustic from over here. So I've got 2 acoustics on the go here. And then the whole thing, to double it up, we're just going to copy the whole thing over. And then if you listen to it now, it's out of like, what's this, 10 minutes work? We've got a huge sounding first section of this track. Now, the last tip that I was going to give you before the end of this video, and this is really about arrangement and drums, is that I've doubled it up here, but the drums are not exactly the same. If you want a really easy way to lift your track and to give a little bit of extra bite to sections, moving your drummer from the hi-hats to the ride cymbal is a real great way. So just copied this exactly the same, but as soon as this gets to the end of here, as soon as the drummer moves over to the ride, it just lifts that section there. And that's it basically. So if you're struggling with getting huge sounding guitars in your tracks, I really suggest you do some of these here. Experiment. I've mentioned it a lot in my videos, but you need to trust your ears and you need to do a bit of trial and error to get this right. So layering this guitar part up once might sound great. Doing it 3 times might sound fantastic. I've done it 4 times. You don't have to do the chugs, but you can add extra bits in there. Like I said, the bass line could follow the main riff, or it could follow this little chugging part here. But this is the extra secret sauce on here, which is the acoustic doubling it up. And it's a real great way of getting huge sounding guitars and that real crisp clarity on the top there. There's new tutorials out each week on this channel, so if you like what you've been seeing, please subscribe. And there's loads of different tutorials, such as the one on Logic Drummer. There's ones on writing chord progressions, how to master your tracks in 15 minutes. So have an explore around. And if you've got any comments to leave, just leave them under the bottom, any tips and tricks that you've come across. Or if you want to complain about the noise on my pickups, then that's fine too. Thanks. Bye.